Somewhere over the Atlantic on a July night, the most protected aircraft on the planet quietly turned around, and almost nobody noticed. Air Force One, the brand new $400 million jet that Qatar had handed over as a gift just months earlier, was supposed to carry the president home from the NATO summit in Turkey. Instead, at the very last minute, the plan changed. The president walked onto a different plane, an older one, a slower one, a jet that has been flying presidents around since the days when George H.W. Bush was in office, and for weeks nobody outside a very small circle knew why. The official story was almost laughably mundane, something about American troops in Britain wanting to tour the shiny new aircraft. But that explanation didn't survive contact with reality for very long, because what was actually happening behind the scenes was one of the most serious protective operations in recent presidential history, and it revolved around a single, chilling piece of intelligence. Iran and its proxies had developed a credible plot to shoot a missile at the president's airplane. This is the story of how that plot came together, how American intelligence caught it, why the newest Air Force One in history turned out to be dangerously unprepared for a war zone, and why the older, battle-tested jet with its lasers and its secret defenses became the only safe way to get the commander-in-chief home. And by the end of this, you're going to understand something that most people watching the news completely missed, which is that this wasn't just about one flight. It was about a years-long, multi-million-dollar Iranian campaign to kill an American president, one that has already produced federal indictments, criminal convictions, and a body of evidence that reads like something out of a spy thriller, except every bit of it is real and it's still unfolding right now. So stick around, because we're going to walk through the timeline, break down exactly what technology protects Air Force One and why the Qatari jet doesn't have it yet, and then we're going to go deep into Iran's assassination playbook, the cartels, the prison gangs, and the hired guns Tehran has used for over a decade to try to get to American leaders without ever putting its own uniform on the ground. If you find this as wild as I do me a favor and hit that like button, drop a comment with your take, and if you're not subscribed yet, now's a good time, because there is a lot more of this coming. Let's start with what actually happened on the ground, because the sequencing here tells the whole story. In early July, President Trump traveled to Ankara for the 36th NATO summit, a high-profile gathering of alliance leaders at a moment when the war between the United States and Iran was still very much active. He flew into Turkey aboard the new Air Force One, the modified Boeing 747-8 that had been accepted as a gift from the Qatari government the year before, and had gone through months of retrofitting to make it suitable for presidential travel. It landed at Etimesgut Air Base outside Ankara, and for a couple of days, everything looked completely normal. Meetings happened, photos were taken, the president held a press conference inside the presidential complex. Standard summit stuff. But something was happening underneath the surface that almost nobody in that press pool knew about. American intelligence agencies had picked up on a credible plot by Iran and allied proxy forces to fire a missile at the president's aircraft. Not a vague, generalized threat. A credible plot. That phrase matters in the intelligence world because it means specific enough, corroborated enough, and serious enough that the people whose entire job is protecting the president's life decided they could not take the risk. The Secret Service moved fast. According to officials who later spoke to CBS News and the New York Times, agents urged the president to change planes immediately, and rather than complete the trip on the new jet, he flew from Ankara to the United Kingdom aboard the old Air Force One instead, before eventually switching back to the newer plane to finish the trip home across the Atlantic. At the time, the American strike campaign against Iran was still going on. The president was sitting roughly 1,000 miles from Tehran while all of this was happening, which is close enough that a launch from western Iran or from proxy forces positioned nearby was well within the realm of plausibility. Here's the part that really shows you how tightly this was held. Even senior figures inside the administration weren't told the real reason for the swap. Some officials were only informed that the plane change was a general precaution tied to broader Iran concerns, not that there was an actual missile plot on the table. Key members of Congress weren't briefed at all, according to reporting from the New York Times. That's not normal. When something is compartmentalized that tightly, it usually means the source of the intelligence is sensitive, the specificity of the threat is high, or both. And to make things even more layered, this particular plot was described as separate from a different piece of intelligence that Israel had shared with the United States around the same period. Intelligence about Iranian efforts to kill the president that some American officials reportedly viewed with a bit of skepticism, wondering whether it was designed to provoke an even more aggressive American response against Iran. So you've got two threads of intelligence running at once, one from Israeli sources that American officials were cautiously weighing, and a second, independently corroborated plot detected directly by American intelligence that was serious enough to trigger an actual mid-trip aircraft swap. When the wheels came down at Joint Base Andrews a couple of days later, the whole thing had already been quietly resolved, and the cover story about service members touring the plane held up in public for weeks. It wasn't until late July that the real explanation came out, when CBS News and the New York Times both published detailed accounts confirming that the plane swap in Turkey was driven by that credible missile threat. And once that story broke, the president didn't exactly play it down. Speaking at the summit itself, he had already acknowledged, almost matter-of-factly, that he is a target. They want to take out the U.S. leader, me, he told reporters. I'm on every list. I saw this morning. I'm on every single one of their lists. And so far, I guess I've been a little bit lucky, but that maybe doesn't last very long. That's about as direct a statement as you're going to get from a sitting president about the fact that a foreign government is actively trying to kill him. And it lines up with something he'd posted just days earlier on social media, where he warned that 1,000 missiles were, in his words, locked and loaded and ready for immediate use if Iran ever attempted to assassinate him. Orders have already been given, and the UMSO military is ready, willing, and able for a 1-year period of time, subject to extension, to completely decimate and destroy all areas of Iran, he wrote. That's not diplomatic language. That's a direct warning shot fired through a keyboard, and it tells you exactly how seriously this threat is being taken at the highest levels of government. Now, let's talk about why this particular plane swap turned into such a big story, because it's not just about which jet the president happened to be sitting in. It's about the fact that the brand new Air Force One, the one Qatar handed over as a diplomatic gift, might not actually have the defensive technology needed to survive a real missile threat. And that is a genuinely serious problem. To understand why, you have to understand what the old Air Force One planes can actually do, because these aircraft are, without exaggeration, among the most heavily defended flying objects on Earth. And most of what makes them that way has been hiding in plain sight for years if you know where to look. The classic VC-25V, the Boeing 747-200 that has served as Air Force One for decades, is absolutely covered in self-protection systems. And while a lot of the deepest capabilities remain classified, a surprising amount is publicly documented because some of the hardware is visible on the fuselage if you know what you're looking at. There's the AN/ALQ-204 Matador system, a set of about 5 infrared countermeasure devices mounted near the tail and behind the engines that emit pulsed infrared signals specifically designed to confuse the guidance systems on heat-seeking missiles. Then there's the AN/AAR-54, a missile launch warning receiver mounted at the tail that passively detects ultraviolet energy from a missile's exhaust plume the instant it launches, tracking multiple threats simultaneously and feeding that information straight into the aircraft's countermeasure systems in real time. And then there's the real star of the show, the AN/AAQ-24, better known as Nemesis, or in its more advanced form, LARCM, which stands for Large Aircraft Infrared Countermeasures. This is a directional infrared countermeasure system, DIRCM for short, and what it does is genuinely remarkable. Instead of just dumping flares out the back of the plane and hoping for the best, it uses a laser mounted in a small pointer and tracker turret to physically lock onto an incoming missile's seeker head and blast it with pulsating infrared energy, strong enough to overwhelm and confuse the guidance system, effectively blinding the missile mid-flight so it loses track of the aircraft entirely. And here's the best part. It does this automatically. No pilot has to spot the threat and manually deploy countermeasures. The system detects the launch, calculates the threat, and fires the laser without any human intervention required, all within a matter of seconds, because when a heat-seeking missile is closing in on an aircraft, seconds are genuinely all you get. On top of all that, the old Air Force One planes still carry the more traditional stuff too. Chaff dispensers to throw off radar-guided missiles, and flare dispensers that burn hotter than the aircraft's own engine exhaust to lure heat-seeking munitions away from the airframe. Between the passive warning sensors, the automated laser jamming, and the old-school chaff and flares as a backup layer, you're looking at a genuinely multi-layered defensive system, one built specifically because this aircraft has to be able to fly into contested or unpredictable airspace anywhere in the world with the President of the United States sitting inside it. Now compare that to the Qatari jet. This 747-8 was originally built as a luxury VIP transport for the Qatari royal family, not as a hardened military platform. And when the United States accepted it as a gift and began the process of converting it into an interim Air Force One, the retrofit was rushed, expensive, and controversial from the start. Analysts who cover military aviation closely have repeatedly raised concerns about exactly this issue, whether the jet would have anywhere near the same defensive suite as the aircraft it's meant to temporarily replace. As of right now, it's genuinely unclear what defensive systems, if any, are actually installed on that plane, and multiple reports have suggested it currently lacks the same level of missile countermeasure technology as the older jets. When a reporter directly asked the president about this gap, about the fact that his primary aircraft might not have real anti-missile defenses while he's flying through a live war zone, he didn't deny it. He basically confirmed it, saying the plane already has a lot of capability, but will be, in his own words, maxed out with additional upgrades. The White House press secretary put out a statement trying to reassure the public, saying the new Air Force One is perfectly safe for the president's travels, but will receive additional upgrades and enhancements in the fall that are expected to take about a month to complete, during which time the president will fly on the old plane instead. Reporters who cover this stuff for a living have pointed out that it's genuinely unclear what kind of meaningful defensive upgrade you can actually complete in that short a window, especially compared to systems like LAY-RCM that were developed and integrated over years. So for now, the safest aircraft on the planet isn't actually the newest one. It's the 14-year-old jet with decades of proven combat protective technology built into its skin, being kept in reserve specifically because it's the plane that can survive what the newer one might not be able to. And look, this isn't some hypothetical, theoretical concern dreamed up by aviation nerds with too much time on their hands. This is happening because Iran has spent years, going all the way back to before this current war even started, building an actual operational campaign to kill American leadership. And Donald Trump has been sitting at the very top of that list since January of 2020. That's when American forces carried out the strike that killed Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the IRGC's Quds Force and the architect of Iran's entire regional proxy network, a strike ordered directly by the president. Soleimani wasn't just some general. Inside Iran, he was treated almost like a second supreme leader, and his death triggered a formal, public, and permanent mandate from Iranian leadership for vengeance against the American officials responsible for that decision. And unlike a lot of angry rhetoric that fades with the news cycle, this mandate has outlived multiple changes in political leadership on both sides, and it has repeatedly translated into real, documented, prosecutable plots. To understand how seriously the U.S. government takes this, you actually have to go back even further than Soleimani, to 2011, because that's when federal prosecutors first exposed exactly how far Iran is willing to go to reach targets inside the United States. Back then, the Justice Department unsealed charges against a man named Mansour Arbabsir, an Iranian American who had been tasked by the IRGC's Quds Force with arranging the assassination of the Saudi ambassador to the United States. The plan was genuinely horrifying in its recklessness. They wanted to detonate a bomb inside a crowded Washington restaurant that the ambassador frequently visited, with total disregard for how many American civilians might have been killed alongside him. To pull it off, Arbabsir traveled to Mexico and tried to recruit what he believed was a senior figure inside the Los Zetas drug cartel, offering $1.5 million for the hit, and actually wiring a $100,000 down payment through overseas accounts tied to the Revolutionary Guard. The whole thing collapsed because the cartel contact he thought he'd recruited was actually a confidential informant working with the DEA. Arbabsir ended up pleading guilty and was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison. But the case revealed something that security analysts have been watching closely ever since, which is that Iran doesn't necessarily send its own trained operatives to do this kind of work. It shops for talent on the open criminal market, treating cartels and hired guns as an outsourced labor pool for political violence. That exact playbook came roaring back after Soleimani's death. Except this time, the target list expanded to include the president himself, along with the officials most closely tied to that decision. People like former National Security Advisor John Bolton, former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, and former U.S. Special Representative for Iran Brian Hook. In August of 2022, the Justice Department unsealed charges against an IRGC operative named Shahram Poursafi, who prosecutors say attempted to arrange Bolton's murder as retaliation for Soleimani's killing. Poursafi tried to recruit someone he met online, initially asking for photographs of Bolton under the pretense of writing a book, before eventually offering $300,000 to have him killed in Washington or Maryland, and dangling a follow-up payment of $1 million for a second hit on Pompeo. He allegedly told his contact to communicate using coded construction language, framing an assassination as a request to build a structure, and at one point complained to his handler that he was under pressure to get the job done before the anniversary of Soleimani's death. Like the cartel plot a decade earlier, the person Poursafi thought he'd recruited turned out to be a confidential source working with American investigators. He remains at large overseas to this day, and the reward for information leading to his arrest has climbed as high as $20 million. Then, in November of 2024, just weeks before a presidential election, the Justice Department unsealed an even more elaborate plot, this one built around a man named Farhad Shakari. Shakari is an Afghan national who came to the United States as a child, spent over a decade in American prisons on robbery charges, and was deported back in 2008. Once he was in Tehran, the IRGC recognized something valuable in his background. which is that he still had an extensive network of criminal contacts sitting inside the American prison system, people who could be tasked with surveillance and operational work without ever needing to be smuggled across a border. According to court filings, Shakari's handler in September of 2024 ordered him to drop everything else he was working on, including surveillance of an Iranian-American journalist in New York, and focus entirely on formulating a plan to kill Donald Trump. When Shakari pushed back on the difficulty and cost of pulling that off, his handler's response, according to recorded conversations later used in court, was chillingly simple. Money's not an issue. Shakari himself remains a fugitive in Iran, but his two domestic co-conspirators, men who had agreed to carry out surveillance work inside the United States, were arrested and convicted in January of this year. And then, just this past March, the most significant conviction yet came down. A federal jury in Brooklyn found a Pakistani national named Asif Raza Merchant guilty of murder for hire and attempting to commit an act of terrorism transcending national boundaries. Court records show Merchant traveled to Iran to receive instructions directly from an IRGC handler before entering the United States in the spring of 2024 with a clear directive: build a functioning domestic network capable of carrying out political violence on American soil. He met with people he believed were criminal hitmen in New York, allegedly making a finger gun gesture with his hand during meetings to communicate exactly what kind of job he was offering. And his plan involved a disturbing multi-stage strategy, stealing sensitive material from the homes of political targets, staging protests to stretch local law enforcement thin, and then using that chaos as cover to eliminate high-profile targets. He paid a $5,000 cash advance to the men he thought he'd recruited. And once again, they were undercover federal agents. Merchant was arrested, trying to flee the country in the summer of 2024, with his conviction finalized earlier this year. If you lay all four of those cases side by side, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Iran almost never sends trained state operatives directly into the United States, because that would be an unambiguous act of war and would trigger exactly the kind of overwhelming military retaliation the president has now publicly threatened. Instead, Tehran runs a deliberately decentralized strategy, reaching out through cartel connections, prison networks, online recruitment, and hired local muscle, building layers of plausible deniability between the Revolutionary Guard and whoever actually pulls the trigger. It's cheap, it's flexible, and if it works, the first news cycle around any successful attack would likely frame it as gang violence or a lone actor rather than a foreign assassination, buying Tehran time before investigators could trace the money back through Hawala networks and encrypted messaging apps to handlers sitting safely inside Iran. It's a strategy built entirely around exploiting the seam between American domestic crime and international terrorism, and federal investigators have now had to build an entire specialized effort just to keep pace with it. Which brings us right back to this month, because in July, on top of everything else going on with the broader war, Israeli intelligence agencies delivered a fresh and highly specific dossier to American national security officials, warning of renewed operational activity out of Tehran aimed directly at the president. That's the piece of intelligence that reportedly ran in parallel with the separate, independently corroborated missile plot that forced the Ankara plane swap. Two completely different threads of intelligence, both pointing at the same conclusion around the exact same window of time. And if you want a sense of just how stretched American protective services are right now trying to track all of this, listen to what the director of the Secret Service, Sean Curran, told reporters recently. Curran has led the president's protective detail before, and he was actually one of the agents standing with Trump during the assassination attempt in Butler, Pennsylvania back in 2024, so this is not someone prone to exaggeration. The numbers at this agency, and certainly I've never seen in my 24-year career, they're off the charts, he said. I think the environment has become very volatile, and that's just across the board. The threat picture and environment is as large as I've ever seen it. For context on just how much things have escalated, the agency had opened somewhere around 7,000 investigations during the same period last year. This year, that number is being described by the man running the agency as unlike anything he's seen in over 2 decades of service. There's actually one more layer to this story worth mentioning, because it says something about how seriously the government treated the secrecy around this whole episode. After the New York Times published its reporting on the security concerns surrounding the new jet, federal officials launched a leak investigation seeking grand jury testimony and phone records connected to the journalists who broke the story and their relatives. That's an extraordinarily aggressive step to take against reporters, and it tells you just how sensitive this information was considered inside the administration. The Justice Department ultimately withdrew those subpoenas, but the fact that they were issued at all shows you the temperature this story was generating behind closed doors. Now step back for a second and think about the environment all of this is happening in, because none of this exists in a vacuum. This is unfolding in the middle of an active, grinding war between the United States and Iran. one where American forces have spent weeks running consecutive nights of precision strikes across Iranian territory, hitting command centers, missile storage sites, and drone infrastructure. Iran, in turn, has been launching ballistic missiles at American bases across the region, occasionally getting lucky hits, despite facing some of the most advanced interception technology in the world. The Strait of Hormuz has effectively become a choke point battlefield, with a naval blockade squeezing Iranian oil exports and cutting into the hundreds of millions of dollars a day the regime depends on to keep funding its military machine. Iran is losing money, losing stockpiles, and losing the ability to project power in ways it once could. And historically, that kind of pressure doesn't make a cornered regime less dangerous. It makes it more willing to take reckless, asymmetric swings. An assassination attempt against a sitting American president, run through cutouts and proxies, specifically so Tehran can maintain deniability, fits that pattern perfectly. It's exactly the kind of high-risk, high-reward gamble a regime under this much economic and military pressure might be tempted to try, especially if their own leadership genuinely believes, rightly or wrongly, that removing Trump personally might change the trajectory of a war that has not been going their way. So where does that actually leave things going forward? The newer Air Force One is grounded from long-haul, higher-risk travel until its defensive upgrades are completed sometime this fall, meaning for the next several weeks at least, the president will be flying in the older, more heavily defended jet whenever travel takes him anywhere near a genuine threat environment. The Secret Service has already shown, with this Ankara swap, that it is willing to make real-time changes to established travel plans the instant credible intelligence comes in, even if that means keeping the reasoning quiet for weeks to protect sources and methods. And on the legal side, federal prosecutors continue building cases against IRGC operatives and their domestic recruits, one indictment at a time, chipping away at a network that, if the pattern of the last 4 major cases holds, is not going away anytime soon, because the mandate driving it isn't tied to any particular Iranian president or supreme leader. It's tied to a killing from 2020 that Tehran has never stopped trying to avenge. What's genuinely remarkable when you zoom all the way out is how much of this played out in near total secrecy for weeks, hiding behind a story about troops touring an airplane, while the actual explanation involved laser countermeasure systems, a 14-year-old jet being kept in reserve specifically because of its proven ability to survive a missile strike, and an active Iranian plot detected and defeated by American intelligence in real time. It's the kind of story that sounds like it belongs in a screenplay, except every piece of it is documented in official statements, federal court records, and on the record quotes from the people actually running point on protecting the president's life. And it raises a genuinely interesting question about the road ahead. If Iran's proxy network has already produced this many documented attempts against American officials over the last several years, cartel connections, prison gang pipelines, online recruitment schemes, and now apparently a coordinated attempt to target the presidential aircraft itself, how many more attempts are quietly being detected and stopped that we simply never hear about? And how many more months will it take before that Qatari jet is genuinely equipped to handle the kind of environment the president is now flying through on a regular basis? That's the situation as it stands right now, and it's very likely to keep developing, because both threads of this story, the war with Iran and the assassination campaign running alongside it, are still very much active. If you want to stay on top of where this goes next, make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the follow-up when more details come out, and drop a comment letting me know what stood out to you most in all of this, whether it's the laser defense systems on the old jet, the sheer number of documented plots over the years, or just how close this recent one apparently came to becoming an actual crisis. If this breakdown helped you understand what's really going on beneath the headlines, share it with someone who'd find it just as wild as you did, and hit that like button before you go. It genuinely helps this kind of deep dive reach more people. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.